I'm not at all superstitious, but I was a bit worried about this title. I like to think this is not entirely my life in simulation. It's going to go on for a bit longer. On the other hand, more realistic would be to call it a half-life in simulation, and that really is a bit too scientific. So I'm going to take the risk that I'm still standing here in 30 minutes' time. Leave it as it is. So when Mike Poole retired as head of Aztec, he gave his last staff talk without the aid of any transparencies whatsoever. I haven't got the nerve to do that. But on the other hand, I feel I need some aid memoirs occasionally. So what I'm going to do is to just give you some pictures to look at while I talk. As you get older, especially when you've had things like retirement dinners from Oxford University and so on, you find yourself looking back rather more on your life. This is unavoidable. So you'll forgive me if my thoughts have been very much further back in the past, so I'm just going to reminisce. So what I'm going to start with is talking about the first time I ever came across a computer. I was a schoolboy. Actually, I just finished school and I was about to go off to university. And I went and spent a year working at Marconi's research labs at Great Baddow in Essex. And there they had a KDF-9 computer, great big old thing. And I was given some equations and told to play around with them, no explanation as to what they were. I'd got to find a solution somehow. So I had a wonderful year delving in books and learning how to write a program and so on. The computer spluttered away, spat out some fumes and so on. And I got some numbers at the end and they seemed happy. And that was the end of my year. So I went off to university. And 2 years later, this man, Neil Armstrong, walked on the moon. And as undergraduates, we all stayed up all night to sit through the event and enjoy it. And a couple of weeks afterwards, I went back to Marconi's to Great Baddow in Essex. And they gave me a few more equations and something else to do. But that time, they told me what I was doing. And I said, but last time I was here, you didn't tell me. And they said, that was because it was a contract with NASA and we weren't supposed to talk about it. It was all to deal with Neil Armstrong's moonshot. So I have no claims, no pretensions or anything. But as a schoolboy, I like to think I helped man set foot on the moon. So I came back to went to university, went to do a PhD, and if you're lucky, of course, you get to visit a nice place for a conference or something. The next picture, which I'm hesitating about putting up, I've never shown to anyone before, and it's a bit embarrassing, but I've got to go through with it, I suppose, so there it is. It's not very good because I had to scan it. That's me about half an hour after I got my PhD. I didn't have to dress up in sub-fusk, even if it was a Cambridge PhD. It was at California, Caltech. And I had to go through an American-style examination with a 2-hour lecture and so on. So it was all very theoretical. Those were the people I was working with, some of whom you'll probably recognize. This one's Kip Thorne, who was quite famous. Who else have we got? That's Jim Hartle, who wrote quite a lot of very well-known works on black holes. And of course, in the middle is Stephen Hawking. I was his first ever PhD student. And so there we were at a conference. And as I say, I should move on because it's rather embarrassing. And if you're wondering, that one is me. And where I got that shirt from, God only knows. But I was an out-and-out theoretician. So I came back to England to a fellowship at a certain college called Trinity in Oxford, and I had 40 years occupying that room in the corner of the President's Lodgings, and sadly I've had to give it up because I've retired. And there I was, working by then, it was actually with Roger Penrose, purely theoretical on twistor theory and so on, until suddenly 2 people came calling. Sadly, neither of now with us, Jeff Manning, who was the head of the Rutherford Lab, and John Lawson. The UK was considering studying heavy ion fusion, inertial confinement fusion, very intense accelerator driving into a deuterium-tritium pellet, causing it to implode, and then it would expand if you put enough power on it, and produce more energy than you put in, and drive your reactors and so on. But they wanted somebody with a very strong mathematical background to come and help with them. And it happened that Trinity had had an association with the Rutherford Laboratory in the past over this, so they came and asked if there was anybody. And as I'd only got one more year left on my fellowship, they asked me if I'd be interested. I had no idea what they were talking about, but it was an opportunity, and so I agreed to go. And John Lawson seemed very keen, and he was actually a wonderful man, very friendly, very natural person. And he was also very strong mathematically minded, and we got on well together. So I went out to the Rutherford Lab, Trinity still paying my salary, and we played around with the basic mathematics of this, deciding it was all incredibly difficult for a year or so. And then Jeff Manning came along to me and offered me a permanent contract. But don't forever think that these days I'm talking about the good old days. The contract came with the words, "I'm sorry, the salary is so low, but we don't have any more money." So I moved to the Rutherford Lab permanently, the lab paying my salary, although I still maintained the association with Trinity. And I had no idea what an accelerator was. It wasn't my background. People were talking a language I didn't understand. And the concept of education and training didn't exist in those days. So I had to find out for myself. Okay, I soon discovered that things like beta functions were not so mysterious. It's only geometry after all. It's just a conic section. So that was easy to do. So I found I could work on the fusion project without knowing too much about accelerators. But the one thing about changing from mathematics to physics or engineering is that you start dealing with numbers instead of equations. So I needed a calculator. Where do you get a calculator from? My group leader came along and said, you can have mine, my old one. So he gave me a calculator. That gave him a good excuse to go and buy himself a super swish brand new one, but that's what group leaders do, I suppose. So there it was. It was a state-of-the-art calculator in, 1975 or something like that. And it was programmable. It had little metal strips you could put in the side. We wrote programs to calculate our mortgage and things like that on it. But it had memories and so on. And I didn't know how to use a computer, how to use the lab system or anything. What I wanted to do was to study multitone injection, how to build up intensities in a beam, fitting lots of beams together, beamlets together into a given size of emittance. It was like fitting elliptical shaped tin cans into a big circle. What orientation, what aspect ratio should they have to fit in best? And I could do that from pure geometry with a bit of optimization. So I wrote a program on that to do it. It only had 20 memories, that was the problem. So I had to be really, really clever with this. And of course it took a lot of time. So I set it up, wrote the program to work out how to fit 6 of these small cans into the large tin. And it ran for about a week and produced the numbers. And when I drew it all out, it looked great. So I set it going for 7, it ran for about 10 days. I set it for 8, that was 2 weeks, and on we went. And I got up to 10, and it ran, and it ran, and it ran, and it ran. And I came into the lab every day, and there were red numbers on it, darting around. Nothing, I just left it and went on, did other things. And I came in one day, and the screen was blank. It had finished, fantastic. So I emptied all the memories, copied everything down on the bit of paper, switched it off to give it a rest. To this day, I don't know how it did it, because each one of those turns I put in had 3 parameters, and I had 10 turns, that's 30 parameters. This only had 20 memory. So I don't know, but it worked, and it was right. it was a clever matter of not overwriting things until you had absolutely finished with them. And I switched it off, and then I thought, well, I should do some more work on this about a month later. And I switched it on, absolutely nothing, completely dead. I just worn the thing out with all this calculation. And the ridiculous thing was, about 20 years later, CCLRC, it must have been by then, the inventories people came round and asked to see the super swish calculator that I got. I had to bite the bullet and tell them I ditched it years ago, got away with it. So things improved, we got onto that. There was a room at the end of R1 which had some ancient old terminals in there. And by then I'd learned how to program in Fortran, or at least I thought I did. But you had to find the right time when there was going to be one of these things available. And I went along with my pieces of paper with everything written out, and I typed it in and spent 3-4 hours typing in this wonderful code I'd written, only to find that every other line was missing when I'd finished. What I hadn't realized was that you actually had to press return twice to get it to accept everything. So it was 3-4 hours completely wasted, and I had to start from scratch again. Of course, it all moves on. So you come into the modern world. So here's my timeline. When I came in with the ancient old KDF9 or whatever it was, we had to climb into a tractor cab. It was like a tractor cab to produce our codes. We would sit and type on a typewriter, and it produced these reams of paper tape with little holes in. If we made a mistake, we had to get down on our hands and knees under the machine and rescue the little white circles that had been punched out, fit them back into the holes with a tiny bit of sellotape, and then repair them and so on until they worked. And we had a big computer which had a total storage of 512 megabytes. That wasn't just for me, that was for everybody. And so we'd type the things out, we'd put them in a box file, we'd send them off to run, and they would come back about a week later. And of course, 9 times out of 10, the thing had failed because of a typing error or something like that. We only had 12 seconds of computing time a week, which if your code was working, you could easily use up on Monday morning. So, but then, of course, we weren't relying so much on computers as people do nowadays. We were doing a lot of paper calculations as well. But we were very limited in what we could output. We were very limited in what we could do with this kind of memory. There was no graphics or anything, so all you would have is just a few numbers on a bit of paper, and often you wanted to know more than this. And you come through to where we are now. We have all the multiprocessors. At the Rutherford Lab, we have the SCARF system. I have 144 nodes, virtually of my own, to use. We have the NERSC system, the American system that covers the whole of the United States with thousands of processors if you want to use them. We can almost model a complete beam, all the particles in a beam. We can run jobs for months and months and months. We're not restricted to 12 seconds. We can output whatever we want. We can store everything and extract whatever we want later on. But always we're up against some barriers. It's natural. You do whatever you can within the limitations, all the way down, whether it's 1970, 1980, or what have you. We've always got to work within the limitations of the equipment. That means we have to develop shortcuts. I don't know what shortcuts I developed on my calculator with its 20 memories, but whatever they were, they worked, and they were very clever. And then we have to balance all the computing time up against the accuracy we've got, because we always want more particles, or we want more time. It's one or the other, and we can't win for everything. So what am I basically doing? I mean, simulation with particles is actually what we do. We are simulating particles, but it's a whole class of physics which you can use to model many other things. People use it to model, for example, problems in fluid dynamics, where the particles are blobs of fluid. We are actually doing literally what it is. We're modeling a particle beam using particles, but they may be macro particles. We may only have 1,000 particles when our beam's got 10 to the 10 in, or something like that. So we've got blobs of particles in all this. And accelerators are very, very complex machines. everything we do is difficult. We can look at small-scale models, in which case we can look at them in quite a lot of detail. We can look at all the boundaries and all the extra little bits and so on fitted in. Or we can do a very large-scale accelerator complex where necessarily we have to simplify everything. And that's going to take up a lot of computing time. We also know that most physical problems are far too complicated to be solved without approximations one way or the other. There are approximations just in the calculations, of course. And often we have to leave a lot of the physics out. We don't put scattering in, we don't put decays in, sometimes we don't even have boundaries in, all because it's far too complicated for what we want to do. We want to get answers for certain other things. And one of the most fundamental things is that in simulation of a particle accelerator, you are doing the calculations again and again and again and again and again, millions and millions of times. It's all very well just taking a problem and solving it once and saying, I've got it to this accuracy. That's fine. There's plenty, that's relatively easy to do in most circumstances. Plenty of codes around for that. Fact is, we've got to do it again and again and again and again. And the errors, we don't want building up and up and up and up. If we're running for 9 months, we want to believe our results at the end are sensible. So, going all the way back, I went off to the Rutherford Lab and I joined John Dawson. And we had a small experiment set up, actually in R8. We had a little electron gun, 2 kV electrons, and a solenoid, 3 centimeters long it was, so it was mainly all end fields. And the idea was we wanted to examine whether we could control emittance in a high intensity beam. So this was a sort of scaled down electron version of the thing we might get, the type of accelerator we might have in fusion. So it had a very high level of space charge in it. Unfortunately, as I said, we didn't have much in the way of output then. And of course, it was 30 years ago, I've thrown it all away. So I had to find that in a paper from 1975, I believe it was. So it's not very clear. And then I remembered coming up on the train, the original is actually in John Lawson's book. And I'd forgotten to look there. So we were learning, at least I was learning to write computer codes with very high levels of space charge, non-linearities because of all these end effects from the solenoids coming in. And so what we did was we had a video camera, the electron gun and the lens, and we had a system of wire grids which could be at 90 degrees to each other. We varied the angles, we varied the voltages on them and so on, and the beam went through and was deflected by all of these, and we were trying to control the emittance in it and at the same time control all the aberrations. And that was one of the pictures we took, my simulation at the top and the video camera at the bottom. And if I could have found a decent picture, you would actually see that it was spot on. It was, we always considered that was one of our first ever achievements. And this is also the simulations for the analytical cases compared with the results of the simulations almost exactly on top of each other, getting a lot of aberration effects in this. And we moved on from that to create a channel of these solenoids, putting the beams down where you can see these effects that we worry about so much now, halos and so on, where the beam is kind of turning itself inside out with a dark ring and a hole in the middle, and then it becomes, well, there's a ring on the outside, and it can become a dark splodge with a halo around the outside and so on. And you can see all kinds of things going on in phase space down here with the non-linearities coming in. I was told I was going to go on a world tour. The state of the art. It was important I knew exactly what was happening in the fusion world. So I was sent to a meeting at Cosner's house in Abingdon. That was the start and the end of the world tour, but I suppose Abingdon's suitably remote. Strange enough place. My first conference didn't come for another year. I had no idea what they were talking about in Abingdon, but after a year or so I'd learnt enough to do some real work. I managed to get some codes working. I believed some of the results, and I designed, along with, I think it was John Maidment, a fusion beamline. For the fusion project, you have to focus this very intense beam down onto a pellet that's only the order of 3-4 millimeters. 4 millimeters is what we were looking for in those days. And one way of doing this was to make the beam really quite big and then focus it down really quickly onto this target pellet under very high levels of space charge. But the problem is about making a beam really large, it sees all the non-linearities in the magnets and so on. So we had a very nice design all to first order, and I thought I should look at it with my code to higher orders. And of course, what should have been a nice, clean splodge in the middle, we found was developing these Mickey Mouse type ears. You know, this was a disaster. Instead of getting 100% of the particles onto the target, I'd only got 46%. And I spent days, day after day, trying to work out a way to correct that. And of course, this always happens 11 o'clock Friday night when I'm due to fly off to Germany on Saturday morning. Lo and behold, I hit on a solution. And it worked, 93% back. A certain system of octopoles and dodecapoles in that exactly corrected it. And so there we were back with the beam exactly on target. So I was redeemed and I went to the conference and I had very good results to present. And it was the only part of the fusion project we proved could actually be done. All the rest of it was beyond the state of the art. So it ended in a report a few years later, and then it was put on the shelf, and we waited much longer before we had another go at it. The other piece of work, which is the work that I always felt that I became better known for, was this. This was the calculator, trying to fit the ellipses into the circle. Produced it very nicely. But by the time I did that, I had no way of modeling that exactly with all the internal effects coming in. And I had by now, and when I modeled that, I produced this. And that became known as Pryor's bananas. The apostrophe in the Pryor's is a genitive. It's not, doesn't indicate there's a letter missing. Anyway, that was Pryor's bananas. And it was showing that what happens in phase space when you have these very high currents is that you get this extending curved effect that looks rather like a banana coming out. I remember when I went to the conference and presented that, a lot of people expressed consternation. They'd not actually seen it before. Maybe they had anyway. I'd not seen it before ever anywhere. Ingo Hoffman, who was, he's a few years older than me, but I've known him for 40 odd years. We were talking about this at the Space Charge workshop in Oxford only a week or so ago, and he said he was so puzzled by this that he went away and tried to reproduce it. So it took him 3 years, but he did reproduce it in the end. So the non-linear space charge codes were really obviously working then. And this is a simulation I did maybe only 10 years back working on Fermilab. A project for Fermilab, and you can see here they are again. The bananas don't look so obviously like bananas, but you can see all those individual turns wrapping around under the space charge. So it's now quite an accepted phenomenon. And well, somehow I found myself in ISIS division. I don't think it existed as ISIS division, it was just Accelerator division when I first went to the lab. This is not how the lab looked in those days, it's not even how it looks now because there's much more development over here. But I found myself in ISIS division and I came under the influence of this man, Graham Rees, who's now retired, long retired, but still comes back for one morning every 2 or 3 weeks with us. Probably the most knowledgeable accelerator physicist I've ever met, and a mine of information and ideas in his very quiet way. And together I think we worked very well. Graham would usually produce the ideas, I would tear them to pieces, knock them about, until together we produced something that we both believed would work. Graham's not particularly computer literate, so a lot of his work is intuitive, and a lot of it's actually right, even if it does need a bit of tweaking. So, being in ISIS, I developed a code to actually model the accelerator. All the previous work had been on transverse beam dynamics, so I wrote a code to look at all the longitudinal beam dynamics. And with Charles Planner, we systematically, I'm sure there are other people involved, there must have been all the different parts of it. So by not mentioning them, I'm not meant to suggest they weren't instrumental in this, but we went through all the parameters, reworking the LINAC, tweaking it here and there and so on, and I did simulation after simulation of the ring, trying to improve it. When I asked Graham Rees, who was one of the main designers of ISIS, where the parameters came from, he told me it was just an educated guess. That's what he thought it ought to be, and so he just produced that. And that was what was in the machine. So I went through, and for example, this is the voltage profile I came up with, which wasn't like Graham's, which went up in up, flat, and so on. Well, I think ISIS was originally designed for 120 microamps, or around that level. John will correct me if it's not right. Sorry?
I wouldn't dream of correcting you.
Okay. There we are. Was designed for 120 amps. And Graham Rees, according to Andrew Taylor, Graham assured Andrew that 120 was the maximum you'd ever get out of it. But as a result of this exercise, of course, the current went up and up and up. I'm sure the iron source people and many other people were involved in this, but changing the parameters certainly made a difference, and it hit 200 microamps and went into the Guinness Book of Records. And I'm still astonished. Well, maybe you'll tell me they've changed in the last year, but those parameters were still the main operating parameters of ISIS, 20 years after I'd first produced them. So there we are. And then I, thought a bit more about where we might go from there, and CERN had an additional, a second harmonic system added in as well, and I came up with one that was roughly like it, but had variable phases and amplitudes, whereas CERN's were all fixed and rigid. And this variable phase allowed us to change the shape of the stable region in phase space and stretch the bunch. So in fact, it's like two bunches together as one with a double center. Stretch the bunch out, and if it's stretched out longitudinally, the transverse intensity is reduced, and so you reduce the space charge, and that effectively means you can get much more beam in. And so in theory, this could be 250 microamps or more, realistically, because simulations are never going to be perfect. Well, simulations will be perfect, but not a perfect model of the machine. 220 would be a good estimate. I was called to a meeting with the neutron people one day who wanted to know what kind of beam they were going to get out of the machine under this new system, because they needed to know how they got to modify their instruments and so on for the different pulse shapes. This was scheduled for 3 hours. And they said, can you show us the beam profiles we expect? And I showed them to us. And they said, no, we want the new beam profiles, not the old ones. And I said, these are the new ones. It's the same as the old ones, because that was the condition. You wanted the beam to be near enough the same as the old one, but just more intense, produce more neutrons. So the meeting finished after 10 minutes, and they went away happy. And I got a warning back to myself. And so I took this from the staff talk of November 2006. The first cycle with the dual harmonic system in operation. It says there's lots of new equipment, major step forward, but then it goes into this one. These are the first results. There wasn't any attempt to put more beam in, but what this is showing is that the beam loss levels were halved. ISIS traditionally had about 6–7% beam loss purely from the injection trapping system, and with this new system already in place, they'd only got 3% beam loss just in the first run. It's been a bit harder to push it up, but it was running at 215, I think it was last week when I saw the monitor. Is it? There we are. Well, there's 215, so that's not bad. And all the while, there was a lot of work going on a spallation source for Europe. Peter's told us about the ESS that's being built. This was called the European Hadron Facility way back in the 70s and early 80s. Became the ESS in the 90s when we had a real blitz on the system. And the group of us at the Rutherford Lab were certainly involved in many aspects. Peter showed a picture with the funnel in, because this is H-. The current you can get from an H- ion source is much less than an ordinary proton source, and so to get the current we needed down the Linac, we had to have 2 ion sources and then funnel the beams into one. So that was a funnel that I worked on, and funnel had never really been built other than one at Los Alamos about 10 years before, and they found it suffered from huge emittance growth, about 50% emittance growth, and so nobody had ever really followed it up. And I did a lot of work on the beam dynamics in this and discovered certain properties of the beam dynamics about making it perfectly achromatic in all planes and evening up the beam oscillations, making the beam as round as possible. And I managed to optimize that down to about 0.5% emittance growth instead of 50%. So I've always wanted it to be built. The front-end test stand that's being built at the Rutherford Lab was intended to be part of the R&D for this, and the plan was to build the front-end test stand and then just one arm of this funnel to test it, and if the beam optics came out as predicted, maybe we would build the other half and completely do the test the funneling. But it's not come to that because things have moved on and we have a different ESS. This one was a short pulse, and so it had rings. We had to build up the intensity, put lots of particles in and so on. This is basically Graham Reese design for many, many years, but with my injection system. The problem was we had to do 1,000 turns in there. That means 1,000 beamlets. And if you took 1,000 particles per beamlet, that was 1 million, and 1 million was pushing it for the computers we had. Really, 50,000 was too many to run the simulations. I found running the simulations for that ring, I could do 1 turn in the night, 1 turn during the day. So 2 revolutions per day, and I actually had to do 1,000 turn injection plus another 1,000 turns. So that was what, 3 years solid computing time. So I let it run for about 3 months. It looked reasonable and didn't go beyond that. Along the way, many other projects, I'm not going into these in many detail. I've done a lot of modelling on the CERN PS and the CERN PS booster, which included identifying some space charge resonances that they set out then to avoid. Mike Poole mentioned PS2. I think we did at least 1, if not 2 designs for a replacement for the CERN PS. I did a design for a replacement booster at Fermilab. The booster was a bottleneck in their injector chain for the Tevatron. And I spent 2 or 3 years trying to do that. We did a tritium project at the lab, notable for its security in that we all had to have special locks on our doors, and the computers were not allowed to be connected to the internet or to each other even, which was fine until as Cyprian reminded me, we went into the room one day and found the cleaners there, so the security was not quite as tight as we'd expected. We looked at lots of stacked rings for a high repetition rate system for ADSR. And the neutrino factory, this was a big study, presented us with a lot of new challenges that required a lot of work. And ISIS upgrades is one above that. Many different ideas for ISIS upgrades. There's just one schematically there, have come out of this over the years. I just put a picture of the neutrino factory. All our work up until then had been to produce a high power proton driver, several megawatts. But the bunch length could be 100, 200 nanoseconds, something like that. This required the bunch length to be 1 nanosecond. So not only do we have to create the intensity, we actually have to compress it. And compressing a beam and building up the intensity require totally different sort of optics. So we had to come up with very flexible rings that would allow us to do all of this. So you can see different, 1, 2, 3, 4 different possible proton drivers, all of 4 megawatts for the neutrino factory we did. And then there's an isosceles triangle, there's a bow tie shape, and then these racetrack rings are for the rings to capture the muons at the end while they decay to neutrinos. And that one, this is what I call a big project. This is what happened to the fusion project. We had another go. in around 2000 in collaboration with Germans. It was called HIDIF, a heavy ion driver for inertial fusion. And this time, instead of everything being beyond the state of the art, we came up with a system that we thought in almost every stage we could do. But you can see what there is. We had 48 ion sources, 16 of rhenium, 16 of thorium, and 16 of bismuth. And they were funneled, the 16 to 8 to 4 to 2 to 1. And the 3 different ions were all sent down the same 10 GeV LINAC. And then they were accumulated in 2 stacks here of 6 storage rings. So 2 rings for bismuth, 2 for thorium, 2 for rhenium, and then 2 for bismuth, thorium, rhenium, building up the intensity. And this is back to where I came in with my calculator, how to build up the intensity for ions. But this one wanted intensities well beyond what I'd been doing before. So in the emittance, where I'd managed to get 6, 7 turns before, I now had to get 20. And there's no way I could do that with conventional means. So what we did was come up with the idea of not injecting in one phase space, but to inject in both horizontal and vertical phase spaces, in other words, into a 4-dimensional phase space at the same time, which meant you could put beam in phase space behind beam, as it would appear, and not beside it, as it had been occurring before. And we managed it. So this is the ring that I designed for that. It's got a very special injection system. Just about every parameter in that was varying during the injection. We managed to get, in fact, I did 25 turns in the end. I managed to get into there. And then you can see what happens. These beams all come out. There's, I think, 12 bunches in each ring. We use 12 bunches from there, 12 bunches from there to produce 24 bunches going down these, getting combined together and focusing in on this tiny little pellet, which by then was actually down to 1.7 millimeters in diameter. And the idea of using the 3 particles, slightly different masses differing by 10%, was they were given the same momentum, therefore they had slightly different velocities, and it was all set up so they caught each other up just as they came in on this poor tiny little beast, which was whacked with 24 beams from below, above, left, right, all around. And we reckoned it would work, but as you can imagine, phenomenally expensive. And we never ever got any funding, even for the next stage of the subject study, even though it was only a paper study still by then. Go on. Okay, so with all our big computers, we can think about doing 10 to the 9 particles in our simulation. And 10 to the 9 is about as many as you'd get in a little pulse down a conventional LINAC. And you can see the difference. So this is a simulation of the RFQ, the SNS at Oak Ridge, with just 1 million particles. That's with 10 million, and this is with 100 million. You can see how much more you can see in the tails and so on. They're degenerated. These may be low intensity, but they're still important. They're going to produce loss in a machine where you don't actually want loss. And that compares with, well, it's difficult to compare them, but that's the effect at the real beam. But even at 10 to the 9, the US billion may not be enough, because this is what happens with the billion particles in a conventional tracking code through that machine compared with the real machine as seen. You can see there's cloud and halo all the way around there. We are looking to get losses down in these machines to the order of 1 part in 10 to the 4. And in a high intensity ring, you've got about 10 to the 14 particles. That means we need to track about 10 to the 10 to even see some of this loss. And that is well beyond the kind of things we're doing. At the moment, at the Rutherford Lab, we have simulations that are running for 9 months. And the question is, I see Jonathan, ooh, the question is whether we can believe the results. Are they accurate still after that kind of period? But that's what we're facing. Always you work right to the level of what's available, and there's always something else you want to see beyond. So what about the future? I'm probably well over time, but you're bearing with me, so that's very good. We think possibly this is with FFAGs. Synchrotrons you can tweak, you can get a little bit more out of them, but if you want to do a lot more, you have to build 3 or 4 and stack them. Maybe with an FFAG, the scope to do much more in terms of beam power, beam intensity, just in a single ring. Okay, there's a picture of Emma because it's the only FFAG we have had in this country. So we're working on a high power FFAG at the Rutherford Lab, which may be used as a driver for another spallation source beyond ISIS later on. But there are not really much in the way of codes to model these things. That requires a lot of work to simulate them. And so what we're doing is setting up a sort of experimental programming collaboration with the Japanese, where they do have an FFAG. And they've told us quite kindly that this is available and we can use it almost whenever we want. So we've had 3 periods out to Japan in the last 12 months, with another one lined up maybe in June, in which we've been taking measurements, trying to understand what happens to a beam in this kind of machines, so we can compare them with our codes, develop our codes, and so on. So all the things we would need for a high-power FFAG are there in one way or another. But how you measure a lot of these things is tricky, because the beam's moving around in an FFAG. In a synchrotron, it's on an orbit. So you have well-known techniques for making measurements, and a lot of them just don't apply in this case. So it's not only diagnostics and codes and so on we're looking at. There's just about every aspect of beam dynamics coming in there. And maybe this is another way to the future. I came in with a small-scale experiment, the electron gun, the lens, the video camera, just trying to study the beam. This is the idea of a palm trap, a plasma trap, of which there is one at the University of Hiroshima. There was one at Princeton until last month, when its funding was cut. Sorry, last year its funding was cut. And the idea simply here is that you ionize, well, it's a plasma, it's an argon plus gas. Ionize it with an electron gun and trap it in a potential well. And then around it you superimpose, or here, 4 rods set up in a quadrupole mode, and you put on a confinement wave. We've got a 1 megahertz one, and you could set it up to model, if you like, a quadrupole system. Maybe by changing the shape, well, we can put a dipole in and so on. So the plasma is sitting there, and then the fields are oscillating, so it's as though the plasma is a beam traveling down this system, feeling a photocell or what have you as it goes through. And we've been looking at resonance effects and so on in this. And this is a desktop thing. It's quite small. It doesn't cost a great deal of money. This is a picture of the one in Japan. There's the plasma trap, and here is the vacuum chamber. It is a very fast, flexible tool to study beam physics. We can do an experiment on it in next to no time that would take 9 months of simulation and would cost many millions if we could build a real machine to actually do the experiment. So it's a sort of in-between simulator. And we've acquired the money, thank you, Susan, and Aztec. And parts are coming in, and we will be building one of these very soon to complement our existing simulation studies. In the citation for this award, you said something about education. I've done a lot of teaching. You won't know who any of these people are. I was just looking through my files, 2006, group of my Oxford students, and I suddenly realized all but 3 of those students got first-class degrees, so I was quite pleased with that. So that is part, not all, of my life in simulation. As I see it, maybe in giving me the award, you were thinking of something else and saw it in a different way. But I'm very grateful for the honour IOP PAB group made to me by giving me the award. And this sort of time in life when you're feeling you've done so many things and maybe you're winding down, it kind of gives you a boost to go on and actually do some more. So, thank you.